The transport ship touched the landing deck of the Academy with a low growl. The metallic walls trembled as engines cooled, and a long hiss of steam drifted into the cold air. Alien cadets stepped aside when the heavy doors opened, their scaled and feathered faces watching with curiosity. They whispered to each other in low tones, their voices sharp with fear and doubt, because they knew who was coming. From the shadows stepped a new cadet, a human, tall but lean, with eyes that held no warmth. His boots echoed against the steel floor as he moved, each step measured and slow, yet his silence was louder than any voice in the room. He did not greet. He did not speak. He only looked at the others with calm eyes that carried weight heavier than weapons. The other cadets felt something cold press against their hearts. Rumors had spread long before his arrival. They said he came from a death world, a planet so cruel that storms could cut stone and beasts could crush iron. To be born there meant learning to fight with every breath. To survive there meant living in a place where nature itself wanted you dead. No other species lived in such worlds. No other species dared. Yet humans came from there and survived. The Academy Warden, a massive creature with bone ridges across his head, stepped forward, his heavy armor clanging with each move. He glared down at the human cadet, his voice deep like thunder rolling in the mountains. He demanded the cadet to state his name, to show respect to the Academy. But the human said nothing. His silence stretched long across the room. The other cadets shifted nervously. Some chuckled, some hissed, but the warden's anger grew like fire. The cadet's lips never moved. His eyes never blinked. He simply stood there like stone. His silence was not fear. It was choice. And that choice burned the pride of the warden. No one had ever dared defy him with nothing but silence. His claws tapped against the metal floor as his jaw clenched. His pride screamed for a reaction, yet the human gave none. The other cadets began to whisper among themselves. They spoke of death worlds, of how humans were not like others. Some said he would break within a week. Others said he had already broken and could not speak at all. But deep inside, a quiet unease crept into their minds, because silence was not weakness. Silence was mystery, and mystery was dangerous. Training began. Weapons clashed and bodies fell, but the silent cadet moved differently. He did not waste strength. He did not stumble. His body flowed like water through every strike, even when beaten, even when blood dripped down his face. He never made a sound. He did not scream. He did not cry. He only rose again and fought until the order to stop was given. The others looked at him with wide eyes. His silence carried weight heavier than victory. The warden watched with growing fury. He demanded noise. He demanded submission. He demanded respect shown in words. But the cadet gave him nothing, and every day that nothing grew into something unbearable. The warden saw not silence but defiance, not quiet but rebellion, and each night his rage carved deeper into his pride. One evening, as the cadets marched back to their quarters, the warden stopped the human with a heavy hand, his claws pressing into the cadet's shoulder. The air went still as others turned to watch. The warden leaned close and growled into the cadet's ear, promising pain, promising suffering, promising to break him until the silence shattered into screams. But the cadet did not flinch, did not answer. His eyes only stared forward, cold and calm, like watching a storm from the eye itself. That night the cadets whispered louder than before. They spoke of Deathworld blood. They spoke of legends where humans hunted beasts larger than ships, where they fought wars without rest, where their silence meant patience, and their patience meant death for anyone who waited too long. Fear mixed with wonder, and the silent cadet became something more than strange. He became something dangerous. The warden swore in his chamber that he would break the human. He slammed his fists against the wall, sparks flying as metal bent under his power. He roared that no cadet, no creature, no fragile Deathworld child would ever shame him in front of the Academy. His words filled the halls like thunder, but the human did not hear, or if he did not care. The next day came with cold light across the Academy walls. Drills began again, and still the cadet spoke no word. Every command obeyed without sound. Every strike carried without cry. His silence spread through the ranks like shadow. It unsettled those who mocked him. It silenced those who once laughed, until only the sound of weapons remained. The warden glared across the yard, his claws curling tight, his voice booming as he pointed at the human, promising that the silence would end. One way or another. The cadet lifted his head, his gaze meeting the warden's, calm and sharp, and for the first time a shiver touched even the strongest among them. The silent cadet had not spoken a single word, yet the academy already feared what might happen if he ever did. The first week of training had passed, and still the silent cadet had not spoken a single word. The academy halls carried his silence like a chain that rattled in every corner, and though the warden barked orders with thunder in his voice, the human obeyed each one with the same quiet and steady control. His silence was not weakness, but to the warden it felt like insult. It felt like rebellion carved in the shape of still lips and cold eyes. The warden was known across the sectors as a creature of power and fury, his body heavy with bone ridges and scars from wars long past. His voice could shatter the courage of an entire squad. And yet this one cadet from a death world answered him with nothing but stillness. It was like shouting into a cave that gave no echo back. And with each passing day the rage inside the warden grew hotter and sharper, like a blade turned in fire. Morning drills began before the first light. Cadets rose in lines, alien wings stretched, scaled limbs tightened, chitin clicked in rhythm, but the human stood always at the end of the line, shoulders straight, eyes forward, lips closed. The warden shouted for voices, shouted for unity, shouted for the call of the academy, and the cadets roared their chants. But the human gave nothing, only silence. The warden's fury burst across the yard, claws slamming against the ground, yet the human cadet's silence remained. The punishments began with extra hours of combat. The human thrown against 3 cadets at once, claw scraping, tails whipping, jaws snapping. Yet each time he rose again, his breath heavy, but his voice never leaving his throat. When struck down he rose. When beaten back he moved forward. The other cadets began to feel unease, because they saw in him not weakness, but a strange power, a control they did not understand, and silence began to spread in the ranks each time he fought, for none dared laugh anymore. The warden's pride howled, so he ordered harsher trials. The human was made to carry stones across the burning field, alien sun beating like fire. Other cadets cried out in pain, but the human carried his load with steady steps, lips pressed shut, eyes locked forward. The silence screamed louder than any shout. The cadets who watched felt their own hearts pound, because they saw a will that did not break, a will that seemed carved from iron itself. Even the nights held no rest. The human was summoned after the others slept, dragged into the cold training hall, where the warden waited with his heavy staff. Strike after strike rained down. The sound of bone and muscle meeting would echo in the empty hall. But still the human did not scream. He did not beg. He did not even curse. His silence was a wall that the warden could not climb, and with each failed attempt to break him, the warden's own control began to crack. The cadets whispered when the warden was not near. They whispered that perhaps silence was stronger than any roar. They whispered that perhaps the human's quiet was more dangerous than any weapon, because he did not break. He did not yield. He only endured, and endurance was a thing that frightened those who lived in fear of pain. One day the warden commanded a new lesson. He placed the cadets in a simulation chamber, the walls shifting to become a jungle of sharp thorns and beasts of teeth and claws. Cadets cried out as monsters lunged, claws ripping, jaws tearing, but the human moved through with steady steps, never rushing, never panicking. His blade struck only when needed. His eyes never wavered, and though blood ran down his side, he made no sound. The silence of his fight was worse than any scream, because it felt like watching death itself move without fear. The warden shouted for him to roar, to show voice, to prove life. But the human only stared through the simulation, his silence cutting through the command like a knife. And when the beasts fell silent on the floor, the chamber ended with the human still standing, lips still closed, body still calm. The warden's rage filled the air like fire smoke, his pride unable to bear the thought that silence had once again won over voice. That night the warden dragged the human into isolation, a cell with walls of steel and no light. He left him without food, without rest, without company, hoping the silence of the dark would break the silent cadet. But days passed, and the human remained, his silence unchanged, his will unbroken, and when the cell door opened again, his eyes still held that same quiet fire. No scream, No word, no cry had left him. The cadets began to fear the warden's obsession, for it was no longer training. It was war between silence and pride. And though the warden carried scars of 100 battles, he could not wound silence. He could not bend it. He could not shape it. The human silence had become a weapon sharper than any blade. The warden gathered the cadets in the main hall, his voice a storm as he pointed at the human. He declared that this silence would not continue, that he would crush it before all of them. He swore the academy would hear the human's voice, whether as a scream or as a broken cry. He swore his pride would not fall before a Deathworld child. The cadets shifted uneasily, because in their hearts they feared the warden's oath. They feared it would end not with victory, but with something worse. The human stood at the center of the hall, shoulders straight, eyes calm, lips closed, as the warden circled him like a beast, claws tapping, voice booming, demanding words, demanding sound, demanding submission. But the cadet gave nothing. His silence was unshaken. His silence was a wall. His silence was a storm waiting. And the cadets who watched could feel it, their own voices caught in their throats, because something about that silence told them a truth they did not want to face. The warden's fury shook the hall. He slammed his claws into the floor and roared that tomorrow would be the end. Tomorrow the silence would break, or the cadet would be broken. Tomorrow the academy would witness the fall of the human. His pride demanded it. His fury promised it. His voice carried it into every year. Yet when eyes turned to the human cadet, they found no fear, no tremble, only calm silence, heavier than iron, sharper than blades. The cadets returned to their quarters with whispers in the dark. They whispered that the silence was no longer strange. It was terrifying. They whispered that perhaps the warden had already lost. They whispered that perhaps the human silence was not defiance but destiny. And their fear grew into respect, because silence that endured punishment was silence that could kill. The night passed heavy and cold. The warden did not sleep. His rage coiled tighter and tighter. The cadets did not sleep, their minds restless with fear. And the human did not sleep, his silence steady, his eyes waiting, his body ready. And when dawn rose, it carried with it the promise of something that none of them could stop, the promise that silence itself would face the storm of pride, and something would break. The dawn rose heavy with clouds of steel light across the academy sky, and the warden stood before the ranks of cadets, his armor clashing like thunder, with every step his eyes burning with rage that had grown through nights. Without rest, his pride demanded the end of the human silence, and he would have it no matter the cost. The cadets lined in the yard, their wings folding their claws, twitching their eyes, wide with fear and curiosity, because they knew today was not training, today was punishment. Today the war between silence and voice would find its end, and all of them would bear witness to it. The human cadet walked into the yard, his steps slow, his shoulders straight, his face calm. He had not spoken a word since the day he arrived. He had not screamed through pain. He had not begged through hunger. He had not cried through wounds, and now he stood in front of the warden with the same cold eyes that had haunted every drill, his lips closed like a lock no power had broken. The warden roared, his voice booming across the metal walls. He shouted that the cadet had shamed the academy. He shouted that the silence was rebellion. He shouted that today he would crush the humans, will until nothing remained. The ground trembled under his rage, but the cadet did not blink. His silence was a shield against the storm of sound. The trials began with strikes heavy and cruel. The warden slammed the cadet with claws and fists, each blow like falling stone. The sound of bones rattled through the yard, yet no scream rose from the cadet. His body bent, his blood spilled, but his silence held. The cadets who watched shifted with unease, because every strike that did not draw a cry was a victory for silence. The warden lifted him by the throat, shaking him like prey, demanding words, demanding screams, demanding surrender. But the cadet's jaw stayed locked, his eyes steady even as the claws pressed deeper into his skin. His lips gave nothing. His breath came slow and sharp. The silence spread through the crowd, pressing into their hearts heavier than chains. Fury burned through the warden, his pride bleeding from wounds no claw could heal. He threw the cadet into the dirt, ordering him to rise. The cadet stood slowly, shoulders straight again. The warden snarled and hurled him into a wall. The steel shook, dust raining down, but the human rose again, without sound, without weakness. The silence cut deeper than any scream could. The cadets whispered among themselves, their voices low like the rustle of leaves in the wind. They whispered that the human could not be broken. They whispered that his silence was not defiance, but strength. They whispered that the warden was no longer in control, but drowning in his own fury. And though they whispered, they dared not say it loud for fear that silence itself might hear them. The warden tried new punishments. He forced the cadet to stand against fire. He forced him to kneel beneath the weight of stone. He forced him to run through blades that tore his skin. But each time the human obeyed, without sound, no cry, no plea, no surrender. His silence was a storm building thicker. With every test, his silence became a shadow over the academy, a shadow the warden could not chase away. Nights came with cruel isolation, locked in darkness, left with hunger and cold. The human endured. He counted breaths, but never words. He bled into the stone, but never gave a cry. He waited with the patience of stone itself. When the door opened each morning, he emerged the same, his eyes heavy, but sharp, his lips still closed, his silence unbroken. The cadets began to change. They no longer mocked, they no longer laughed. Their voices fell quiet in the halls, for even they felt that every word spoken was too fragile in the presence of such silence. The human was no longer strange. He was something more. He was something feared. His silence was legend forming before their eyes. The warden's pride twisted like fire in a storm. He saw his control slipping through claws. He saw cadets staring at the human with awe, not fear. He saw himself becoming weaker with every day the silence endured, and he could not bear it. He swore before the academy that the next trial would end the silence or end the human. His voice cracked with fury, but his oath carried across the halls like thunder. The final trial came. The cadets gathered in the largest chamber. The walls black, the lights sharp, the floor stained from battles of old. The warden stood at the center, his claws raised, his eyes burning. He declared that today the silence would die. Today the cadet would scream, or he would not rise again. The human was dragged into the center, his body scarred, his arms bruised, his blood still fresh, yet his eyes calm, his lips closed. His silence steady. The warden struck again and again, claws tearing, bones bending, yet no sound came. The human only stared through the storm of violence, as if the warden was wind against stone. The fury of the warden grew beyond measure. His pride screamed, his power shook the walls. He lifted the cadet high by the throat in front of all. He roared into his face, speak or die, speak or scream, speak or be broken. But the cadet's lips parted with no voice, only breath silent and heavy, his eyes never wavering. The chamber held its breath, the cadets frozen, as if time itself had stopped. Every eye locked on the human, every ear waiting for sound that never came. The silence stretched long, heavy, unbroken, and the fear in their hearts deepened, for they knew this was no silence of weakness. This was silence of control, silence of power. The warden pressed harder, claws digging deeper, his muscles straining to crush the neck in his grip, his roar shaking the air. Yet in that moment the human's hand rose slow and steady, his fingers wrapping around the warden's arm, and for the first time the silence moved with force. The cadets gasped, their whispers cut short. The warden's eyes widened with shock. The silence that had endured for weeks was now something else. It was not stillness, it was not weakness, it was action, coiled tight, waiting, and now it had begun to break free. The human's grip tightened, not with rage, not with fury, but with calm power. His silence was not ending, it was speaking in a new way. It was speaking through motion, through control, through defiance carved in the body, not the voice. The warden felt the strength of Deathworld blood pressing against him, and for the first time in many years fear crawled into his chest. The cadets saw it too, and their hearts raced, because they understood the truth that had been hidden behind silence. The human had never been broken, he had never been defeated, he had only been waiting for the moment when silence would not hold but strike. The chamber shook with tension, the silence heavier than screams, the air sharp with the weight of what was about to come, and every cadet, every watcher, every heart knew that this was the breaking point, and nothing would. The chamber was silent after the human's hand rose and gripped the warden's arm. Silence stretched across every wall and into every breath of every cadet. The air was heavy with waiting. The warden stared at the cadet with eyes filled with fury and disbelief. His pride cracked like stone struck by hammers. His claws shook with rage as he roared into the human's face, demanding sound, demanding surrender, demanding weakness. But the human only tightened his grip, and his lips stayed closed. The warden ripped his arm free and hurled the cadet across the chamber. The human struck the steel floor with force that would have broken bones of weaker creatures. Yet he rose again slowly, his eyes calm, his body scarred, his silence steady. The cadets gasped, their hearts beating fast, because they saw a thing that should not be possible, a thing that no one else could endure. The warden commanded the chamber to shift. Walls groaned as heavy plates moved, forming pillars and jagged spikes. The lights turned blood red, and the floor cracked open to release steam. The trial was meant for the strongest of the strong, a place where no cadet had ever walked without fear. The warden pointed at the human and roared that this would be the end. He swore that silence would break here. He swore that the academy would finally hear the scream of the Deathworld child. The human stood among the fire and smoke, his breath slow, his eyes locked on the warden, his silence unshaken. The trial began. Beasts of steel poured from the walls, their jaws filled with blades, their eyes burning with artificial fire. They charged with roars that split the chamber. The cadets cried out in shock. The warden folded his arms, waiting to hear sound, waiting to see fear, waiting to taste victory. But what came instead was silence. The human moved like water, his body twisting between claws and blades, his strikes sharp and precise. He did not waste strength, he did not waste motion. Each beast that lunged at him fell with a clean cut or a crushing strike. His silence carried through every movement like music, without sound, and the cadets watched with wide eyes, their fear turning into awe, because they realized that the human was not only enduring, he was mastering the trial. The warden roared louder, his claws striking the controls. He unleashed fire from the ceiling. He summoned storms of sparks. He raised walls that shifted and crushed, yet the human moved through it all. His silence never broken, his lips never parted, his body scarred, but his eyes calm. The cadets whispered to each other, their voices trembling. They whispered that the human was something more than flesh. They whispered that his silence was a weapon sharper than any blade. They whispered that the warden could not win. The beasts lay broken, the fire burned out, the storm faded, and still the cadet stood, his chest heaving, his eyes locked on the warden, his silence a wall that no fury could break. The warden's pride shattered under the weight of it, his rage twisted into desperation. He could not allow silence to win, not before the eyes of the academy, not before the eyes of the cadets who had once bowed to his command. He stormed across the chamber, his claws flashing, his armor ringing like thunder. With every step, he seized the cadet by the throat once again and lifted him high before all the cadets. He roared with all his might, speak or die, speak or be crushed, speak or fall forever. But the human's lips parted with no sound, only silence and breath, his eyes colder than stone, his silence heavier than the warden's rage. The warden pressed harder, his claws cutting into skin, his strength pouring into the grip. The cadets watched with hearts pounding, their bodies frozen in fear, because they knew something was coming, something that silence had been holding back since the beginning, something that could not be stopped. Once released, the chamber grew darker, the air heavier, silence itself felt alive. The cadet's hands rose again, his grip finding the warden's arm, his body bleeding, his breath short, yet his silence unbroken. His fingers dug into the ridged flesh of the warden's arm, his eyes never leaving the warden's face. The silence spoke louder, now it spoke. In every heart it spoke, in every mind it said that silence was not weakness, it was control, it was power, it was death waiting in stillness. The warden's roar cracked with strain, his pride collapsing as fear pressed against his chest. His strength met resistance that felt impossible. The cadet's arm shook with effort, but it held, it did not fall, it did not yield. The cadets, watching, felt the truth sink deep into their bones. The warden was no longer in control. The warden was no longer the master of this hall. The silent human was. The struggle filled the chamber with weight heavier than war. The cadets could not breathe. They could not speak. They could not move. The silence commanded them more than the warden ever had. The silence was king. The silence was terror. And then the moment came when the cadet shifted, his grip twisted with sudden force, and the warden's body bent with shock. A sound like cracking bone echoed across the chamber, louder than any roar, louder than any scream. And then silence returned, heavier than before. The warden's eyes wide, his grip faltering, his claws falling away. The cadet, still holding his arm, still silent, still calm. The cadets gasped, some cried out, some turned away in fear, but none could deny what they had seen. None could deny that silence had broken the storm of pride. The warden staggered, his rage gone, his strength fading, his body trembling. He looked into the cadet's eyes and saw no weakness, no fear, only silence, endless silence, silence that had defeated him before the eyes of all, silence that had stripped his power away. The cadets watched with horror and awe, because they knew the truth. The warden was broken, and the human was unbroken. The warden fell to his knees. The chamber shook with the weight of his collapse. The cadets whispered louder, their voices trembling. They whispered that the human could not be defeated. They whispered that silence itself had triumphed. They whispered that the academy would never be the same again. The human stood over the fallen warden, his lips still closed, his eyes still calm, his silence still heavier than stone. The trial was over, yet nothing felt finished. The cadets knew this was not the end. It was only the beginning. The silence had spoken through action, and it had broken the strongest among them. The silence had turned fear into legend, and the legend would spread far beyond the academy walls. The cadets knew they had witnessed something they would carry forever, something they would never escape. The chamber was still filled with smoke and ash. The warden lay broken. The cadets stood frozen, and the human cadet still stood in silence, his body scarred, his breath steady, his eyes calm. The silence had not shattered. The silence had not weakened. The silence had become the strongest voice of all, and every heart that heard it knew they would never forget this day. The hall of the academy trembled with the weight of what had just happened. The cadets stood frozen in their places, their eyes wide, their claws and wings and limbs shaking with fear, because before them lay the warden broken on the ground, his body heavy as stone, his pride shattered into fragments that no command could repair. The air itself seemed to hold its breath as the human cadet stood above the fallen giant, his silence a blade sharper than sound. No one spoke, not a single whisper dared escape lips, because silence ruled now, silence heavier than chain, silence colder than the void beyond stars. The cadet's face was pale, and blood dripped down from wounds across his arms and chest. Yet he stood unshaken, his shoulders straight, his eyes calm, his lips sealed, as though nothing in this galaxy could force them open. The silence filled the chamber and pressed into every heart, until cadets who had once mocked now lowered their eyes, unable to meet his gaze. The warden gasped for air on the ground, his claws twitching as he tried to rise, but the weight of silence pressed him back. His roars had once filled halls, his voice had once commanded armies. Yet now it was useless against the quiet strength of the human. The cadets saw his power crumbling, not from lack of strength, but from the presence of something stronger, something invisible, something born of Deathworld blood. The warden turned his head, his eyes meeting the humans in rage and disbelief and desperation, and still the cadet gave nothing, no words, no sound, no scream. The silence was the only answer, and that silence was louder than thunder. The cadets felt the truth inside their bones. They felt that silence was more dangerous than fury, more lasting than pain, more powerful than command, and they shivered because they had never known silence could be weapon. The human bent slowly, his body aching yet steady, his hand pressed against the floor as he rose to full height again, standing over the warden, who lay defeated. His silence did not celebrate, his silence did not gloat, his silence only endured, and that endurance was terrifying. The cadets felt their throats tighten, for they knew that if the human ever chose to speak, it would not be words, it would be judgment. The warden gathered his last strength, his claws slashing weakly, his voice breaking as he demanded once more for sound, demanded once more for weakness, demanded once more for surrender, but his voice cracked and failed, his claws struck empty air. The cadet's eyes stayed locked, calm and cold, no fear, no anger, no pity, only silence, and that silence was heavier than the strike itself. The cadets who watched began to shift back, their feet scraping against the stone, their eyes wide with something new, not only fear, but respect, because they had seen strength tested and broken, yet silence had not broken, silence had not bent, silence had stood tall. When pride had fallen, the legend of the Deathworld human was being carved in their minds, wordless but eternal. The chamber seemed to darken around them, the shadows thick and heavy, the silence like smoke filling lungs, until every breath felt shallow, every heartbeat loud in the chest. The cadets wanted to run, yet they could not move, their bodies frozen by the weight of the moment, and in that stillness the human cadet finally parted his lips. For the first time since his arrival, since the first day when the ship touched the deck, since the first challenge, since the first blow, since every punishment, every trial, every wound, his lips opened, and the chamber leaned forward. The cadets waited with every nerve in their bodies. The warden stared, wide eyes trembling. The silence pressed heavier and heavier as the human's mouth formed the shape of sound. But nothing came, no word, no cry, no roar, only silence, only breath. His lips moved as if to speak, yet chose not to. The weight of it broke across the chamber like storm wind. The cadets gasped as if struck, for they realized the human was choosing silence. He was not trapped in it. He was not forced into it. He held it. He controlled it. And that control was worse than any voice could have been. The warden's chest heaved, his rage burned out into ash, his strength drained into weakness, his eyes hollow with defeat. He collapsed fully to the ground, no roar left, no pride left, no power left. And still the cadet stood tall, his silence unmoved. The cadets realized the truth, that silence was victory, silence was dominance, silence was final. The academy had been built on sound, on commands, shouted, on roars, that shook walls, on voices that demanded obedience. Yet now it stood under silence, and silence had won. Silence had broken the strongest among them. Silence had bent every will in the chamber without a word. The cadets looked to one another, but none dared speak. Their throats locked, their minds heavy, their bodies trembling, because they knew that any word would sound weak against silence. They knew that even to whisper was to admit fear. They knew that silence was now their master, and they bowed their heads, not from order, not from command, but from truth. The human cadet turned his gaze across the chamber, his eyes moving slow across every face. His silence followed like shadow, heavy and unshakable. The cadets felt the gaze pierce through them. They lowered their eyes further. They clutched their weapons tighter. Their hearts pounded louder. Yet no one dared break the silence. No one dared betray the strength that stood before them. The moment stretched long like an eternity. The silence, a storm that never passed. And then slowly the cadet lowered himself to the floor, his knees touching the stone, his hands resting against his thighs, his eyes closing, not in defeat, but in calm. His silence, now softer, yet still heavy. The cadets realized he was not their enemy. He was not their rival. He was something beyond. He was silence itself. The warden tried once more to lift his head, his lips trembling with the attempt to speak. But no voice came, no strength remained. He fell back down, eyes closed, chest rising weakly. And the cadets knew his reign was over. His command shattered, his pride destroyed. The silence had claimed victory forever. The cadets would whisper of this moment long after the chamber emptied. They would whisper of the silence that never broke. They would whisper of the human who endured beyond pain, beyond hunger, beyond punishment. They would whisper that silence was power, and that power was more dangerous than anything they had known. But for now no whisper came, no word came, only silence ruled, and silence remained. The human opened his eyes again, his gaze steady, his lips still closed. He breathed slow, the silence around him alive and endless. The cadets dared not move, dared not speak, dared not even breathe. Too loud. The moment belonged to him, the moment belonged to silence, and silence would decide what happened next. The chamber air was thick like smoke, pressing into the lungs of every cadet as they stood in silence, their eyes locked on the human cadet, who remained upright despite wounds and blood. His shoulders square, his gaze calm, his lips closed. His silence was no longer strange, it was terrifying, it was alive, it was command itself. The warden, who once ruled with voice and fury, now lay on the stone, his chest rising heavy, his claws scraping weakly against the floor as he tried to rise. The cadets felt fear crawl into their bones, for the warden had never been weak, the warden had never fallen, yet now they watched as he trembled under the weight of silence, and in that trembling they saw the breaking of something greater than muscle, greater than armor, greater than bone. They saw the breaking of pride. The warden forced himself upright, his body shaking, his jaw clenched, his voice torn raw as he roared once more. His sound filled the chamber, but it was hollow, it carried no power, no weight, no strength. His roar once meant control, now it meant nothing against the silence that stood before him. The cadets felt it too, their ears caught the sound, but their hearts answered only to silence. The human cadet stepped forward, slow and steady, his boots echoing across the floor, each step striking harder than the warden's roar. His eyes locked cold and unblinking, his silence louder than thunder. The warden lifted his claws wide, his armor scraping sparks against the ground. He charged with fury born from shame, from rage, from desperation, but the silence did not move. The strike came down, heavy claws sweeping to tear flesh and bone, yet the cadet moved with Deathworld precision, his body bending, his arm rising, his hand catching the claw in mid-strike. The chamber shook with the clash of strength. The cadets gasped, their hearts leaping into throats, for they saw the human hold against the monster that had ruled them all. The warden pushed harder, his muscles screaming, his breath ragged, his pride burning. But the cadet's grip tightened, his silence steady, his body unyielding, his eyes sharp. The sound of bones creaked through the chamber as strength met strength. The cadets could not believe what they saw, for no one had ever stopped the Warden, no one had ever faced him without breaking, yet this human stood firm in silence. The Warden howled, his other claw striking like lightning, but the cadet twisted, catching again, holding again, silence wrapping around every move. The Warden's fury cracked louder, his armor shook, sparks flying, yet the cadet held his silence, never faltering, his breath slow, his grip iron, his calm unshaken. The cadets trembled. They whispered to themselves, though their voices barely rose. They whispered that the silence was more powerful than rage. The struggle bent into something more. The cadet shifted his weight, his body coiled like a predator, his grip snapping the Warden's arm with sharp sound that split the chamber. The Warden roared in agony, falling to his knees. The cadets gasped, their eyes wide, their hearts racing. But the cadet did not stop. His silence moved him forward, his hands wrapping around the Warden's head, his grip heavy, his arm steady. The Warden thrashed his body, striking his claws, slashing his tail, whipping, but nothing broke the hold, nothing shook the silence. The cadet's eyes locked on his enemy. No hate, no joy, no pity, only silence, endless silence. The Warden screamed for him to speak, screamed for him to cry, screamed for him to break, but his voice cracked into emptiness, and the silence consumed it. The cadets could barely stand, their limbs shaking, their minds reeling. They saw the unthinkable happening before their eyes, the breaking of the Warden, not by another roar, not by another power, but by silence, by calm, by control that no punishment could touch. They understood then that the Warden was not losing to human strength alone, he was losing to silence itself. The cadet tightened his grip, the Warden's neck bent, his eyes wide, his voice choking, his claws digging into stone with desperation. Yet nothing saved him, nothing freed him. The cadet twisted with sudden motion, and the sound of bones snapping rang through the chamber like thunder. The Warden's body went limp, his strength gone, his pride destroyed, his reign ended. The cadets froze, their breath stolen, their hearts stopped for a beat, for they knew they had just seen the breaking of the Warden. The cadet let the body fall heavy against the floor, his hands dripping with blood, his chest rising slow, his silence still unbroken. He did not roar, he did not celebrate, he did not speak. He only stood, his silence heavier than ever, his silence darker than shadow, his silence louder than death itself. The cadets stared, unable to look away, unable to understand, unable to deny the truth. The silence after the snap was worse than any sound. The cadets felt it press into them, suffocating, cold, alive. The silence spoke without voice. It told them that humans from death worlds did not break. It told them that silence was not weakness, but strength. It told them that when silence moved, worlds fell. They shivered, for they knew this truth would spread beyond these walls. It would spread across systems. It would spread across galaxies. The human cadet turned slowly, his eyes scanning the ranks of cadets, his silence following like a storm. They lowered their heads. They could not meet his gaze, their voices trapped in throats, their claws trembling against weapons. None dared to move, none dared to speak. Silence ruled them all, silence commanded them more than the Warden ever had, and they bowed to it in fear and respect. The body of the Warden lay still, the chamber smelled of iron and ash, the lights flickered, the air thick. Yet the cadet stood tall, unbroken, his silence now legend carved into the memory of all who stood there. The cadets realized that they had seen more than victory. They had seen transformation. Silence had become voice, silence had become action, silence had become power. The Academy would not forget it, the galaxy would not forget it, for silence had broken pride, silence had broken power, silence had broken the Warden, and from that day forward the cadets would never laugh at silence again. They would never mock stillness. They would never question Deathworld's strength. They would remember the human cadet, who spoke with no words, who acted with silence, who killed with calm. The cadet stepped back from the broken body, his breath steady, his eyes sharp, his silence endless. The cadets could feel it follow them even as they stood in place. They knew it would follow them forever. They knew it would shape their training, their battles, their lives, for silence had changed everything, and nothing would ever be the same. The chamber of the Academy lay in heavy silence, the Warden's body still against the cold stone, the cadets frozen in ranks, their eyes wide, their throats locked, their minds filled with the soundless echo of what they had just seen. The human cadet stood tall, his body torn with wounds, his arms streaked with blood, yet his stance unshaken, his shoulders straight, his eyes calm, his lips still sealed. Silence had ruled the trial, silence had broken the Warden, silence had conquered the Academy, and now silence waited for what would come next. The cadets dared not move, their claws curled, their wings folded, their scaled and feathered bodies trembling beneath the weight of quiet, for never in their lives had silence Felt like this never had silence, felt like a storm never had silence, felt like command. They lowered their eyes not by order, but by instinct, as if the silence itself pressed their heads down in respect and in fear. The human cadet breathed slow, his chest rising and falling with steady rhythm, his gaze sweeping across the chamber, meeting eyes that could not meet him back. His silence dragged across every heart, heavier than iron, sharper than blades. He turned his head toward the warden's body, then back to the gathered cadets. The silence grew colder. The cadets knew something waited, something they could not escape. The warden had roared with power, he had commanded with fury, he had ruled with voice, but his voice lay broken, his pride crushed beneath the weight of Deathworld silence. The cadets whispered inside their minds, though not with lips, for no one dared to break the moment. They thought to themselves that this silence would spread through halls, through worlds, through empires. They thought that the human had not only broken a warden, he had broken the very idea of what power was. The human cadet lowered his head slightly, his lips parting once again, and the cadets felt their bodies stiffen, their hearts pound, their lungs catch, for they had waited since the first day, since the first trial, since the first wound. They had waited to hear what he would say. They leaned forward, without moving their ears, straining though the silence still pressed heavy. They knew something was coming. The lips moved slow, shaping a sound that was more than voice. The breath came with weight heavier than the chamber itself. The word carried on the edge of silence itself. It was not a scream. It was not a cry. It was not long, only one word enough. The cadets gasped, their throats tight, their minds spinning. That one word cut through silence like lightning across dark skies. It echoed against walls, it echoed inside hearts, it echoed in places deeper than sound. It was not command, yet it was law. It was not roar, yet it was power. It was not long, yet it was endless. The word enough carried weight of all that silence had held, all that silence had endured, all that silence had become. The warden's body lay still, but the cadets felt his defeat burn hotter as the word carried across them. They realized that silence had spoken, not with screams, not with speeches, but with a single word that meant everything. Enough meant the end of cruelty, enough meant the end of mockery, enough meant the end of weakness, enough meant the rise of something greater. The cadets bowed lower, their knees touching the stone, not by command, not by training, not by habit, but by something deeper, something primal. They bowed to silence, they bowed to the word, they bowed to the Deathworld Cadet, who had finally spoken. And when he spoke, he changed everything. His silence had been legend, his silence had been storm, his silence had been death, and now his word was destiny. The human cadet did not continue, he did not speak more, he did not waste sound. His lips closed again, silence returning heavier than before, but the silence was no longer the same. It was different now. It was silence after word, silence after judgment, silence after truth. The cadets felt it press into them with new weight. Silence had not ended with the word, silence had grown because of it. The cadets whispered now only inside their minds. They whispered that the galaxy would hear of this. They whispered that the academies of other worlds would shake. They whispered that the leaders of empires would tremble. They whispered that silence was no longer absence. It was presence. It was power. They whispered that humans did not need many words. They only needed one. The chamber slowly emptied as the cadets were dismissed, but none dared raise their voices. The silence followed them into halls, into quarters, into dreams, their thoughts repeating the single word, enough, again and again, like a drum inside the chest, like thunder across endless skies. The legend began that night, carried in whispers softer than breath, carried in silence stronger than walls. The human cadet remained alone in the chamber, his eyes staring forward, his breath steady, his silence alive, his word already spreading beyond him. He did not seek glory. He did not seek power, he only endured, yet endurance itself had spoken louder than any voice could. His silence had conquered, his silence had broken, his silence had changed the academy forever. The warden was carried away, his body broken, his pride destroyed, his name already fading into shadow. No one would remember him as commander, no one would remember him as master. They would only remember him as the one who fell to silence, the one who was broken by enough. The cadets gathered in their quarters. That night none spoke aloud, yet all shared the same thought, all carried the same image. The human cadet, standing over the fallen warden, his silence steady, his word heavy. They knew they would never forget it, they knew they would never escape it, and they knew that the galaxy would soon know it too. The human cadet sat alone, his eyes closed, his breath steady, his silence calm. He had not come to command, he had not come to rule, he had not come to break, yet silence had made him all these things, without his choice, without his wish, and he accepted it with calm, for silence was not burden to him, silence was life. The stars above the academy shone cold and distant, their light touching steel walls, their glow seeping into empty corridors, and though no sound filled the night, the word carried still enough, carried across stone enough, carried across sky enough, carried into hearts of those who had seen it, those who had felt it, those who would never be the same again. The academy slept restless, every cadet dreaming of silence, every cadet waking with fear and respect in their chests, every cadet carrying the truth that silence was power, that silence was voice, that silence was human. And when the morning came, they marched not with laughter, not with chatter, not with noise, they marched in silence, their steps heavy, their breaths steady, their eyes forward, and they knew the academy had changed forever. The human cadet walked among them, silent as always, his lips closed, his eyes calm, his word unspoken again, for silence was enough, silence had always been enough, and always would be enough. The legend of silence had begun, and no one could end it.